morning, buongiorno to all of you. We start right away with a presentation of the document Sorores in Spe, a two voices presentation, as is customary in good ecumenical circles, an Anglican and a Catholic perspective. So we start with the Anglican perspective with the Right Reverend Dr. Jamie Hawkey, who is Canon Theologian at Westminster Abbey, Chair of the Westminster Abbey Institute, and visiting professor at King's College in London. He's also by fellow of the Clare College in Cambridge University, where he's also been teacher and dean of the studies. His expertise is ecumenism and ecclesiology. He has been also member of the Reformed Anglican International Official Theological Dialogue. He has a very long list of commitments and roles he has been in charge of. I will just mention the one that is closest to us. He's governor of the Anglican Center in Rome, and he is a chaplain to Her Majesty the Queen. Please, Dr. Jamie Hawkey, we look forward to your Anglican vision of the document. And of course, he's a member of the steering committee of the Malines Conversation Group. Please.
Well, thanks to Dr. Rossi for that very warm and generous introduction, and to Father Jim for his welcome. As Jim alluded in his introduction, it is, of course, with such sorrow and anxiety that Mariana Hnip, one of our own members, cannot be with us today because of the war in Ukraine. And it might be judged a luxury that we are here discussing a topic such as Anglican orders when our brothers and sisters are under bombardment in Ukraine. So just before I begin, I wanted, if I may, to read a paragraph from the latest joint statement of the International Reformed Anglican Dialogue, which was on koinonia, on communion. Because, of course, war is one of the worst possible breaches of koinonia, one of the worst possible disruptions of communion. And we should remember that what we're talking about today, the restoration of communion, the intensification of koinonia, is itself deeply related to the healing of the whole of creation. The Christian commitment to justice and peace comes from the life, death, and resurrection of Christ in the power of the Holy Spirit. Sin is judged and found wanting, and the new horizon of hope is opened up through our repentance and faith. Human community can be reshaped by the bonds of love. Barriers of race, class, and gender will be crossed. There is good news for the poor, freedom for the prisoners, sight for the blind, and liberty for the oppressed. To receive the gift of koinonia prompts proclamation in life and words of the love, hospitality, reconciliation, and justice that characterize the triune God, as the Church is sent out without reserve to share in God's mission of reconciliation, which extends to all people and all of creation. Let it be so. So to Sorores in Spe. Much has been written on Leo XIII's bull, Apostolicae Curae, and the responses to it. The responses began, of course, with a lengthy letter from the Archbishops of Canterbury and York entitled Sapius Officio, in which the Archbishops painstakingly responded in detail to the negative judgment on the question of Anglican orders, whilst also introducing their own critique of the document's theological method. Quote, "In overthrowing our orders, the Archbishops wrote, he, the Pope, overthrows all his own and pronounces sentence on his own church." End of quote. Since then, most scholarly engagement with this text and its judgment has focused on addressing historical inaccuracies and inadequacies, has focused on questions relating to form and intention, and since Unitatis Redintegratio and the emerging Archic process, a thoroughly changed context in which Catholics and Anglicans have rediscovered an intimate family likeness and developed a rapprochement of theology and practice. The document, Sorores in Spe, does not directly address questions of historicity or historical context, which have been explored in much detail elsewhere. For example, in the Anglican Benedictine Dom Gregory Dix's The Question of Anglican Orders, and more recently in Bill Franklin's centenary volume of essays published in 1996. However, the Malines Group's work on this subject certainly has engaged with these broader issues, not least during its 2015 meeting in Boston, with papers on the sacramentality of the Church, the role of memory and tradition, the Catholic faith and apostolic succession, and indeed the reception and heritage of Apostolicae Curae. My own paper on that occasion argued that the Anglican ordinal, judged as defective by Pope Leo in terms of form, should be seen as but one voice amongst many within a broader humanist conversation about rites and orders prior to and during the Reformation and Counter-Reformation periods. For example, no less an authority than St. John Fisher believed that the imposition of hands alone, and not the correction of the instruments, was the essential form of the sacrament of order. A deeper study of history may yet still help us with this topic. But Sorores in Spe emerges from the entirely new context in which Catholics and Anglicans now find themselves. To quote the final report of Archic 1, the new context, formally endorsed by Cardinal Willebrands in 1985. The Malines Conversations Group has been working since 2013 on the relationship between the reality of life and the truth of faith. Why is it that what we have come to say about one another theologically is so frequently not represented in practice? Sorores in Spe represents a kind of harvesting of the extraordinary levels of agreement represented by the Archic process and the profound insights of the liturgical and ecumenical movements in the 20th centuries which our churches share. The title of the document, Sorores in Spe, comes from an inscription on the joint tomb of two English queens buried in Westminster Abbey. The half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth Tudor, both daughters of Henry VIII, lived and reigned during some of the most turbulent years of the 16th century. Mary is well known as a deeply pious Catholic monarch, whilst Elizabeth is often described as England's first Anglican queen. Despite the personal, political, and religious animosity which characterized their relationship, they were eventually buried in the same tomb on the instruction of King James I, Elizabeth's successor as monarch. James had more than a passing interest in the reunion of Christendom, and as if to explain the implicit symbolism in their joint burial, he commissioned an inscription in Latin on the base of the monument, which reads, in translation, "Partners in throne and grave, here we sleep, Elizabeth and Mary, sisters in the hope of the resurrection." The drafters of this document and the Malines Conversations group members decided that an allusion to this joint burial could be very helpful. St. Paul VI, in his sermon at the canonization of the 40 English martyrs in 1970, spoke hopefully of the day when the Catholic Church would be able to embrace her ever-beloved sister in the one authentic communion of the family of Christ. Our two churches, with their common roots and a substantially shared life of faith and service, still live in hope of the resurrection, a genuinely united ministry through, with, and in Christ, caput et corpus, alongside one another. Sorores in Spe explores how this relates to the question of Anglican orders in 4 sections. Whilst it's a deeply theological document, it's not written to be appreciated by professional theologians alone. The first section offers a short history of Anglican-Catholic relations from 1896 onwards, beginning with the process which culminated in Apostolicae Curae and Cepus Officio, a section on the Malines Conversations, including Dom Lambert Baudouin's famous essay L'Église anglicane unie et non absorbée. It moves to discuss the achievements of Archic and Iarchum, and finally celebrates an ecclesiology of symbols. Since Pope St. Paul VI famously gave his episcopal ring to Archbishop Michael Ramsey in 1966, prior to the first meetings of Archic, pectoral crosses, stoles, rings, most recently a crozier head, have been presented as gifts by popes to Anglican clergy. Frequently underplayed in formal reflection, this narrative offers a mutually illuminating counterpoint to the formal theological dialogue, which, in the words of our document, quote, reveals a different, deeper reality about mutual recognition, which extends beyond the brusque negative judgment of ordination rites in 1896, end quote. The first section closes with a question which is really formational for the rest of the document, quote, can statements which were made about one another's life and identity prior to the rediscovery of such a deep and shared sense of identity and mission still be deployed as if such growth in mutual recognition, both explicit and implicit, had not taken place?" End quote. Our second section is a journey into the hermeneutics of tradition and salvation. My friend and colleague Professor Geldhof will say much more about the methodology of this section in his presentation. But in many ways, this is the engine room of the whole document. Harvesting the insights of the ecumenical and liturgical movements with a substantial series of reflections on the Second Vatican Council, Sorores in Spe argues that these developments, faithful to the tradition, provide a hermeneutical key for understanding the depth of the new and shared context in which Anglicans and Catholics now know each other. La Nouvelle Théologie and the wider ressourcement currents in the early to mid-20th century themselves offered a new kind of language which found a ready home in the archic process and offers a richer and broader lens through which to consider questions including apostolic succession, the foundational nature of baptism, and the topic of priesthood. Our document argues that the topic of ordination should best be analysed through a soteriological lens, rather than relying on one or other more reductive epistemologies. This, we suggest, is a faithful reading of the challenges and opportunities laid down in the documents of Vatican II. The third section of Sorores in Spe addresses the essentials of church, Eucharist, and ministries. Note the order here. There is an implicit suggestion that church precedes ministry, and that ministry can only be understood within a wider ecclesiological landscape. This section explores the lex orandi of both our communions. Catholics and Anglicans have experienced substantial liturgical reform since 1896, and the Anglican rites of ordination, note rites plural because each member church of the communion has its own rite, have undergone their own renaissance in the spirit of both the liturgical and ecumenical movements. Indeed, prior to the publication of the Common Worship Ordinal in my own Church of England, the chairman of the Liturgical Commission sought the views and advice of Catholic liturgical scholars teaching in Rome. There is now a close correlation between Anglican and Catholic rites, the inner logic of which can be sensed in the consensus expressed in the joint statements of Archic on ministry, ordination, and Eucharist. But perhaps even more importantly, when seen within the context of the preceding section, Sorores in Spe pointedly concludes that when there is such a shared pattern of liturgy, Eucharist, and devotion in ordination rites, quote, "One must conclude that there is such a density of sacramental grace that a narrow focus on the question as to whether the form and formula of the ordination rite are precisely correct can actually obscure the mystical reality of what is taking place." End quote. This refers, in the words of St. Thomas Aquinas, to that which is the enunciated reality itself, rather than that which is simply enunciated about it. Throughout the Malines group's discussion of these questions, and indeed throughout the document, there has been an insistence that the lived experience of Christian sacramental life must be one criterion by which we judge contested questions. Now, importantly, this section does not ignore the reality of the ordination of women as deacons, priests, and bishops in many parts of the Anglican communion. Anglicans are painfully aware of the language of new obstacle, as articulated by the official Vatican spokesman in 1994. But Anglicans also hope that Catholics appreciate our language of reception and the theological seriousness with which many Anglican provinces have approached this question. But Sorores in Spe articulates how the specific historic and contemporary injustice on orders, in general terms, needs to be addressed before our churches engage on the important topic of ministry and gender. Again, to quote the document, "The fact that women can, in most provinces, now be ordained does not itself mean that the Pope's condemnation of 1896 must be applied to the present situation." end quote. In short, it's clear that we need a robust, honest, and theological dialogue about gender in general and how gender and ordained ministry relate in particular. But the introduction of a subsequent further question does not render the primary question invalid. Apostolicae Curae operates on its own ground, and it is that ground that Sorores in Spe seeks to question. We have grown together in a way which makes the judgment of 1896 untenable on theological and historical grounds, but also in the lived reality of ecclesial and sacramental life. From an Anglican perspective, the negative judgment of 1896 was deeply problematic on grounds of theology and history, but it also failed to appreciate the reality of what was, by then, nearly 350 years of sacramental ministry in Anglican England. The fourth and final section of Sorores in Spe introduces two examples of ecumenical progress and the healing of history, which would have seemed impossible within the theological worldview of the late 19th century. The joint declaration on the doctrine of justification between the Catholic Church and the Lutheran World Federation is the first of these, illustrating how new insights and a shared language can overcome earlier doctrinal condemnations. The second example is the ecclesial recognition by the Catholic Church of the Assyrian Church of the East, and the subsequent judgment that the anaphora of Addai and Mari, which contains no ad literam institution narrative, should indeed be considered a valid and genuine Eucharistic prayer. In this example, the ability to get beyond particular forms of words, and therefore to reconcile what had appeared to be a fundamental liturgical anomaly, reveals an extremely flexible application of Catholic theological categories for the sake of the Church's unity. Here, effective sacramental life can be a sign of authentic ecclesiality rather than the other way around. It is this effective sacramental life, already partly attested to in that language of grace amongst churches and communities not in full communion with the Holy See, celebrated in Unitatis Redintegratio, which is another basis for the reconsideration of the negative judgment of 1896. The contemporary life of a particular church is fundamental for assessing that church's apostolicity. And it may well be that a re-examination of the tautologous language of ecclesial communities would be a very helpful step along the road. So to round up, as well as the basic conclusion of this document relating to the condemnation of Anglican ordinations and what this text believes to be the unsustainable theological position of 1896, Sorores in Spe also suggests, quote, that the implied judgment that the apostolic succession of the Church of England was lost at the Reformation should be re-examined in the light of contemporary ecclesiological and liturgical understandings of the variety of means by which apostolic succession takes place within authentic traditions of Christian life and worship. The image of walking together, so confidently espoused by Pope Francis and Archbishop Welby, compels us to an honest re-evaluation and celebration of one another's ecclesiality. As long ago as 1980, Pope St. John Paul II praised the methodology of archic as one which would scrutinize together the great common treasure, to clothe it in a language at once traditional and expressive of the insights of an age which no longer glories in strife, but seeks to come together in listening to the quiet voice of the Holy Spirit. We are no longer nourished by enmity and controversy, but by a common life of grace in Christ. We suggest that the implications for a fresh consideration of Anglican ministry are profound and transformative. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Hawkey, for this presentation, an interesting presentation for an interesting document. And thank you for providing us not only the structure, but also the conceptual key crossroads of the document that really makes the document familiar to us. Thank you very much. now I turn to the Catholic perspective, and we have a wonderful platform of speakers in this study day. So the next speaker giving us the Catholic perspective, always from a member of the Malines conversation group, is Dr. Joris Geldhof, who is Professor of Liturgical Studies and Sacramental Theology at the Catholic University of Leuven, where he also is chair of the Liturgical Institute and chief editor of their official journal, Studies in Liturgy. His field of expertise is very interesting, I would say really challenging, and it's focused on liturgical studies and the Eucharist, but in the way they intersect, and I would almost say reaching out contemporary issues. So Christian sacramentality in a post-Christian, post-secularized world. So we look forward to hear your perspective, Dr. Geldhof. You have also published extensively in these areas. Professor Geldhof also has been president of the Societas Liturgica. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My thoughts about the hermeneutical principles which led us when we were drafting Sorores in Spain center around two big clusters. These clusters have to be seen as complementary and cumulative. That means that they mutually reinforce, undergird, and also nuance each other. It is even possible to see some overlap between both. The first cluster is the inspiration and wisdom drawn from the liturgical movement. In particular, its conviction that it is not only possible, but also very enriching to construe a theology based on the lex orandi, or liturgy, of the Church. The second cluster is the enormous legacy of the Second Vatican Council, which is not primarily something of the past, but rather something for the future. I will subsequently discuss each of these two clusters. They both consist of 4 dimensions. 2 times 4 is 8. 8 is a number which in Christian symbolism refers to the idea of renewal through the redemption of creation. The 7 days of God's creative activity and Sabbath rest are complemented by the 8th day of renewing everything. 8 means the recapitulation of the entire universe, including all future, present, and past generations of its inhabitants, to make it pass through the gates opened by the resurrection, and thereby bring it to completion. The ultimate goal of ecumenism is also to make the militant and peregrinating Church pass through those gates and to present to God an unblemished offer. However, before I enter too much into eschatological speculations, let me refocus the attention on earthly hermeneutics and human finitude. Notwithstanding this jolt towards normality, it is not without meaning that in a time which has become addicted to the practical, the available, and the immediate, and which cannot but see opportunism and strategy everywhere, we wrote Sorores in Spe not only for concrete purposes, but also in view of a bigger picture. The contours of that picture are not yet lucid, but neither are they limiting. From within the within, we kept an eye on the beyond. We were aware that what we were doing may be both timely and, strangely enough, but healthily, unzeitgemäß. But let me now start with this first cluster, which is the wisdom from the liturgical movement. From the beginning of our work as a group, liturgy, thickly understood, that is, not as a mere series of ceremonies guided by the rubrics, but as a genuine celebration of God's saving work, has been on the horizon of our work. It was not always there as a topic, but it shaped our thinking and our praying together. Put differently, liturgy was not the bricks and timber we fabricated our house with, but the very soil on which we built it. Moreover, as is only logical today, we took care of an environmental-friendly construction and an appealing, generous architecture, in concordance with the landscape and the climate. We hope that our work will be appreciated as not alienating, let alone polluting, its source. The liturgy as a source. Fons, where do we know that from? In any case, the 20th century liturgical movement has constituted for us a major source of inspiration, both theologically and methodologically. Not only what it achieved was inspiring to us, maybe even more so, the ways in which it operated. First, the liturgical movement developed a distinctive way of theologizing. It substantially contributed to the awareness that theology is so much more than a scholarly commentary on the authoritative faith formulations of the Church. Theology is not to be reduced to dogmatic and Dogmengeschichte, no matter how insightful they are and continue to be. Theology is not the art of proving that Christians are right about God's existence, and that the doctrines held by the Church make sense as a consequence of the fact that she has consistently followed in the footsteps of the apostles. By doing theology herself, that is, not only by reflecting about it from a distance, the liturgical movement showed that the lex orandi of the Church, the inexhaustible treasure of its liturgical prayer, is directive of what it thinks and how it thinks. Liturgy is not extrinsic to the faith. It is not the case that there is first faith content, independently, and then a ritual or prayerful expression of it. Liturgy shapes the faith. It is not a mere product or result of it. Worship is not simply doctrine performed ritually. The liturgical movement has, so far, not been able to make undone the consequences of extrinsicist and expressivist views on liturgy, treating it always as a graspable and controllable thing. But it has shown a way, promising way, out of many deadlocks. Our text is situated in the wake of the liturgical movement's strong ontological and theological claims about liturgy. Second, the liturgical movement developed a model of ressourcement before that notion became associated with an innovative way of doing theology, nouvelle theology, around the middle of the 20th century. There are reasons to assume that what the leading examples of the Nouvelle Théologie movement, the ressourcement movement in French theological circles accomplished, was somehow anticipated by the liturgical movement. Its representatives too went back to the sources, full of expectations, openly, inquisitively, and self-confidently. They somehow jumped from contemporary concerns right into the depths and riches of ancient Christianity and found there a lot of intriguing insights unspoiled by post-Tridentine Thomisms and scholasticisms. Scholars and pastors associated with the liturgical movement hardly hid their amazement and contentment when they ventured to liberate themselves from conceptual rigidity. They had been trained to swim back and forth fixed distances in a swimming pool, but all of a sudden they discovered a lake. They had been told that swimming pools were the only places where to swim safely, but they found out that they could perform well in the open air too. Thoroughly versed in philology, classical languages, historical criticism, capable of doing rigorous conceptual analyses, Nouvelle theologians and key figures of the liturgical movement rediscovered solid building stones of the Christian tradition, the richness of which they had hardly suspected. They thereupon developed models of thinking and research which subsequent generations did not have to imitate, but could use freely and creatively. In this sense, we consider ourselves as standing on the shoulders of what Nouvelle theologians and scholars from the liturgical movement have accomplished. Third, as a concrete example of what this implies, one could refer to the liturgical movement's unpacking of profound layers of meaning contained in the concept of sacrament. The Latin word sacramentum does not simply evoke 7 rituals that throughout the vicissitudes of contingent history have come to play a privileged role in Roman Catholicism. It also renders the Greek concept of mysterion, which is itself connected to the idea of God's unfathomable counsels and their communication to humankind. Mysterion is moreover connected to the idea that this communication is somehow set forth in history. Revelation and incarnation undeniably have a unique and singular dimension, but not to the extent that they are confined to one identifiable moment only. They are perpetuated in history, passed on, transmitted, especially in the Eucharist, where gratitude for God's magnalia or mirabilia is expressed and experienced. Along with this deep understanding of sacrament as mystery, and mysteries, and mystery interwoven with history, came a resistance to locating the core or the essence of a sacrament in one single moment or thing, although this had become customary in sacramental theology, canon law, and ecclesial teaching. Sorores in Spe wholeheartedly embraces a mystery-filled theology of sacraments and sacramentality. In doing that, we deliberately move away from patterns of thinking which try to establish the certainty of faith on the foundations of an absolute control over material or formulaic details. Instead of focusing on one causa causing one effect, and on one signum signifying one res, we have confidence in the multiple, multivarious, and symbolic approach to the sacraments, what they mean and what they bring about. Fourth, the liturgical movement was also famous for its dealings with active participation, of course. Much more important for us than some of its interpretations along the lines of liturgical activism is the reality that liturgy indeed is an encompassing action people are invited to participate in, with their bodies and their minds, with their will, imagination, passions, intellect, and desires, that is, with their entire existence as whole persons. Active participation is unthinkable without an integrative and holistic anthropology. The latter should even promote the former, and vice versa. Active participation is equally unthinkable without a participatory action. In line with what I have said already, the quality of that action is not surprising. It is the work of salvation as concentrated in the Paschal mystery, with its universal significance and its singular connection to Jesus Christ. Sorores in Spe is yet another voice in the choir singing the song of active participation. Its sound is theological. It does not play a false ideological note. The second cluster is the lasting legacy of the Second Vatican Council. Vatican II has been an unparalleled historic event. It was so much more than a gathering of responsible church people discussing contemporary concerns. It was not a business meeting with an agenda preparing future policy. In addition, it cannot be properly assessed and appreciated today according to the stereotypical opposing tendencies of continuity versus discontinuity with tradition. Vatican II itself is tradition. It is part of the long chain of ecclesial gatherings through which something of God's will is passed on to humanity. Correspondingly, we have worked with Vatican II as a point of reference, not primarily because of the beautiful texts it produced, but because of its being a theological event of sorts. In a way, even if this makes not much sense from a purely chronological point of view, Vatican II was for us maybe the source to which to turn in a true ressourcement mode. Itself calling for an aggiornamento through ressourcement, the three words matter, aggiornamento through ressourcement, it delivered us fresh and living water, so dearly desired by deer. And hopefully we won't become a hunted game ourselves. However, to the extent that by drinking and showing where we drunk, we naturally let our guard down, let us hope that our vulnerability will turn out to be our strength. First, Vatican II emphasized a dynamic understanding of revelation. Revelation is more about the act of revealing, revelatio, than about the promulgation of revealed things, revelata. It is God's self-communication in such a way that human beings can grasp it, not fully, but sufficiently and always provisionally. It is not that one can see everything once the bride's veil is lifted, but it is enough to seal a mystery of love and fidelity. Revelation, moreover, is all about the subtlety of transparency, which helps one remove any obstacles caused by obscurity or worse, obscurantism. Christ's light doesn't tolerate hiddenness. Revelation shows light in dark places. It assists, supports, and accompanies when a way out must be found. God's revelation is there not for its own sake, but for the liberation of people from different kinds of enslavement. Revelation saves, redeems, emancipates, enlightens, manifests, clarifies, indicates, educates, etc. This outstandingly verbal instead of substantive understanding of revelation, along with its underlying communicative, dialogical, and dynamic theology, replacing a substantialist or essentialist metaphysics, was a great source of inspiration for us. Second, and similarly, Vatican II's ecclesiology helped us immensely in finding a theological language adapted to different layers or spheres of ecclesiality. There has been a time in Roman Catholicism when it was almost natural to understand the reality of the Church as constituted solely by a specific class of people ministering in it. This ministering of the ordained clergy was paired with administration and an administrative mentality that permeated the deepest fibers of the church fabric. The church resembled a factory managed by professionals, interested above all in the growth of the company and the maximization of profit at the expense of its competitors. As a condition for this, a strict control over the production process, as well as the employees on the payroll, their education and their profile was a necessity. There wasn't too much room for continuous formation, let alone for creating a safer work environment and a more pleasant atmosphere on the floor. Diversity, if at all allowed, was mistrusted rather than embraced. Pluralism was a threat instead of an opportunity. In sum, it seemed as if the economy of salvation was taken over by single-issued officials. The church offered services, but did not really serve. Or in the language of the liturgy, it offered services, but did not really celebrate. There was a mass production, but not a Eucharistic enthusiasm. Fortunately, Vatican II helped clear the way so that a veritable enthusiasm for the Eucharist could be found again. This created options for considering important themes, including consecration, communion, community, unity, harmony, real presence, grace, etc., with fresh eyes. The attention Vatican II had for the Eucharistic ecclesiology was an important motivation for our drafting Sorores in Spe. Third, and more specifically, this was the case particularly for some thoughts about Christ's triplex munus. Christ's being and acting as priest, prophet, and king greatly shapes the theological imagination when it reflects on important issues and wants to structure variegating ideas. Sharing in Christ's threefold office turned out to be a particularly powerful pattern when we try to think about the relationship between common priesthood and ministerial priesthood. The differences between these two do not run parallel with the distinction between laity and clergy. And baptismal priesthood is always already sacramental, royal, and prophetic. Moreover, priesthood is both presbyteral and sacerdotal, and it is not just by becoming a priest that one shares in the Church's priesthood. Sharing in priesthood, and priesthood as something to share, became important focuses of our ideas. We accordingly deepened ideas on deacons and bishops as well, about the pastoral nature of all kinds of priesthood, and about the many and divergent ways this reality is lived, explained, and experienced, not only by ordained priests, but also by other members of Christ's body. Fourth, the Second Vatican Council gave rise, of course, to one of the most comprehensive liturgical reforms in the history of the Church. It comprised not only a revision of the books, the rubrics, the prayers, and the texts, but a reconsideration of the whole sacramental infrastructure of the Church. It was neither window dressing nor the building of a new construction. Both the foundations and the facade were tackled. It was in fact a major remodeling of the entire palace, including the gardens. With respect to the reforms of the rites of ordination, this specific room in that palace was even done twice, and twice thoroughly, actually. The first time already in 1968, the second time in 1991. The revision of the liturgical books incisively affected the Church's self-understanding. It profiled the role and the meaning of the bishop as well as that of the gathering assembly. It was no longer focused on handing over symbols of power, but on entrusting chosen people with a special mission. There came an accent on sharing, giving, and testifying. All of this, and so much more, greatly inspired us when we were writing Sorores in Spe. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Geldhof, for this speech, not only for presenting to us what I would call the backstage of the Malines conversation group, so the way you work at the level of methodology, but also for pointing out some very important critical points that certainly will raise some discussion. And thank you for a very imaginative speech. I'm sure that some of the images you have used about the transparency of revelation, eschatology of the ecumenical movement, and so on will remain with us. And also, I would say, as a Centro Pro Unione, mentioning Vatican II as an event, as a very special meaning. So now we had access to the document, and we had originally 15 minutes of discussion. I would say perhaps a little bit less than 15 minutes. I would suggest we can start thinking about 8 minutes, which we have learned it's a symbolic number, extremely rich. So let's open up our discussion. And for the moment, we just take quick remarks or quick questions. We will have later on more time for the discussion. So please, if you have questions or remarks, to the speakers. And please, of course, the invitation is also for those who are following online. And let me say, the spirit of this day is really to be a study day. So every single contribution and idea is really warmly welcome because it's a laboratory in a sense. So we just have to put together ideas, questions, and difficulties perhaps also.
My name is Father Jim Puglisi, so maybe I can start by posing a first question. I found both of the presentations really fascinating, and after having read and studied the text that you presented, think that an important dimension that you bring forward is the ecclesiological one. And this ecclesiological one has to be seen, however, in a different context today. I will speak more this afternoon about that when I talk about sacramental ecclesiological reflections, which takes us out of the question of dogma, canon law, and beyond to what Joris spoke about, the Mysterian aspect of the Church that we cannot control. So I would be very interested in knowing how you would articulate ecclesiological approach that you would use in this document. You spoke very little about canon law whatsoever, which is not a bad thing, but however, if canon law is taken as positivistic law, then it is a bad thing. But if we take canon law as a theological reality, then we're looking at something different. So how did you deal with that aspect? Because obviously the papal bull has a canonical importance for us. So maybe either Jamie or Joris might want to address that question.
Thank you, Jim, very much. You're absolutely right. There's almost nothing, in fact, possibly nothing at all, explicitly about a canonical perspective in the document. I think how the sort of vision we've tried to articulate relates to issues of canonicity is fundamentally concerned with the sort of mentality shift that this document is arguing for. It really is a sort of a shift in theological mentality. And if canon law is a response to the gospel, if the canon law is actually sort of shaped by the Church's living of the Paschal mystery, I suggest that canonical perspectives, whilst on one level needing integration, may also need challenge by, as it were, the primary theology, which is the grace, the mysterion of the Paschal mystery. So I think, were I to be asked how canon law might respond to this document, there are two answers. The first is it could simply condemn this document, straightforwardly condemn it. The second is that canon law itself, in both our communions, by the way, canon law itself in both our communions, can accept the challenge from the kind of theologia prima which this document is trying to argue for. Joris, is that fair? That was yes.
Well, I wanted to begin on that last observation that canon law is in a way secondary, and we focused our attention on the primary. That we're not against canon law, of course, and we hope that canon lawyers can develop canon law that accommodates what we've tried to do, and that's how it in a way always happened in history. And a positivistic and a very rigid kind of canon law will not help us. And very strict divisions between supernatural and natural and so forth, that will not be of any help.
Thank you very much. Because you raised both the question of the method and the mentality shift of the document, which I think is really the reach of the document. When we deal with ecumenical methodologies, the questions behind is always to what extent can they be reproduced in the bilateral dialogues or in other groups, because in a certain sense we look for patterns that could be used in other situations, but on the other hand, we also know that each bilateral dialogue has a story and a method of its own, and a context, and each relations and each group and each document has its own method. So sometimes, for example, when we deal with receptive ecumenism or differentiated consensus, now you know that there is this raising interest whether differentiated consensus can be applied to Pentecostal Catholic dialogue, for example, which is yes and no, because it's so different from all the other dialogues that have used differentiated consensus that it's really a question. So my curiosity is, do you expect your methodology also to be applicable to other contexts, or was it really very much linked to the context of the Malines conversation group and the Anglican Roman Catholic dialogue? But as I said, I'm sure that also Professor Hen will give us more insight later on, maybe on the hermeneutical approaches in a wider sense. But I don't know if you have already a quick answer to this question. Thank you.
I think what we've done is very contextual. It certainly has to do with the very rich history of family likenesses between Anglicans and Roman Catholics, and maybe the water is a little deeper in other ecumenical dialogues that we're involved in. So I think that what we have been able to come up with is certainly, to a large extent, dependent on a deep familiarity and friendship. Another spontaneous reflection that I have is that I don't think that what we've done is already mature enough to label it. We don't have a label of like receptive ecumenism, the consensus, and so forth. We don't have that, and maybe we don't need it.
I think what Joris has just said is profoundly true. The document is shaped in part by years of work with a group of close theological friends, Anglicans and Catholics, working intensely on these kind of conversations. So it has an accent and a grammar which I think is distinctive. That said, and I would bow to Professor Hen's expertise on this, but it strikes me, at least, that this is faithful to the kind of theological dynamic which is present in the 3 rounds of Archic so far. This is not off track from that. It's reliant on it in some ways. It is implicitly, I think, reliant in some ways on the broad concept of receptive ecumenism, although it doesn't draw on it explicitly. But I think it's a faithful, as it were, further iteration of the kind of language, the kind of theological concepts that Archic has used in the past and is continuing to deploy now. But yes, I mean, this is a young document. It will, as ever, be dependent on reception and critique for the sake of the Church in the world. And I think I would want to underline those final words, the Church in the world. This is fundamentally important because of God's promise of salvation for the world.